This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neat Sahone, and today is Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. In some episodes of this series, I look at the worst cards in a particular category, and that's what we're doing today, with a look at the worst multicolored creatures. Generally speaking, multicolored creatures are harder to cast than their monocolored counterparts, and that also tends to mean that they are more powerful than monocolored cards of the same mana value. However, this isn't always true. And there are plenty of multicolored creatures out there that are absolutely awful. To be eligible for this list, a card had to be a creature, and it had to be multicolored. In all, there were 2,074 cards that met these requirements, and in this video, I'll give you my picks for the 10 worst of the bunch. As usual, for a card to make it on one of my worst lists, it has to be bad in all three of Magic's main play modes. It has to be bad in Limited, it has to be bad in 60-card constructed formats, and it has to be bad in EDH. Additionally, the card has to have been bad for its entire history. In other words, for me, for a card to be considered one of the worst in the history of the game, it has to be bad in every single format, and for the entire time it has existed. Alright, let's dive in with my picks for the 10 worst multicolored cards in Magic. At number 10, I have 5 cards from the same Shadowmore Cycle. All 5 of these cost 2 generic mana and 2 allied colored hybrid mana for a 3/3 that can't be blocked by creatures of the enemy color. Because these cost hybrid mana, which means you have the option of paying one of 2 different colors of mana, they aren't quite as hard to cast as most multicolored cards are. That does need to be taken into account when evaluating just how bad they are, but even with that in mind, these are horrible multicolored creatures. A 4-mana 3/3 is a terrible starting rate, and the upside these bring along just isn't anywhere near enough. The fact that they can't be blocked by creatures of a single color will not come up all that often, and if you're looking to hate on a particular color, there are roughly 1 million better cards out there for that purpose. I mean, even if you end up playing a deck that is the specific color that these hate on, it isn't like your opponent is going to be deathly afraid of these highly inefficient creatures. I will say that these abilities were a little less awful in Shadowmore Draft, where multicolored creatures were relatively common, meaning this unblockability did come up sometimes, but they still really weren't worth playing. Though these are certainly the best cards on the list when it comes to Limited. In addition to just being bad cards, this kind of cycle design also comes off as extremely lazy and uninteresting. Luckily these days, the cycles that we see generally have more variety than simply changing one word of text on the card. At number 9, I have Petrahydrox. This is another hybrid mana 4-mana 3/3 with a really bad text box. Petrahydrox bounces to your hand anytime it becomes the target of a spell or ability. This isn't all downside, of course, because it does mean Petrahydrox will bounce to your hand anytime your opponent targets it with removal, but the fact that this has such a bad stat line helps make that really not matter. A 4-mana 3/3 with no evasion to speak of is far from imposing, so it isn't like Petrahydrox represents any sort of significant threat to your opponent most of the time, whether they're attacking or blocking. You also can't do anything to augment Petrahydrox, which is usually what you want to do with an inefficient, hard-to-kill creature, because Petrahydrox will get bounced to your hand anytime you target it with anything. In the end, the fact it doesn't die to removal just isn't that impressive. You still have to pay 4 to recast this thing every time, and your opponent also has the ability to easily bounce it with things like activated abilities, which makes this even uglier. At number 8, it is Steelleaf Paladin. This is a 6-mana 4/4 with First Strike. That is not a good rate, and the Paladin comes with an Enter the Battlefield ability that is mostly downside. It forces you to bounce a green or white creature you control to its owner's hand. This means if the Paladin is alone, you just shouldn't cast it because it will just bounce itself. Returning most creatures to your hand isn't a great deal either, because it means you have to spend mana to cast the thing again, and you started by playing a super inefficient creature in the first place. You can use this, of course, to help you rebuy an Enter the Battlefield ability, but this is an incredibly clunky way to do it. You can find hundreds of more efficient ways to abuse Enter the Battlefield abilities than paying 6 mana for an inefficient creature that makes you recast something to get the ability again. At number 7, it is Merfolk of the Depths. This is just a French vanilla creature. In other words, it has no abilities apart from a keyword. In this case, Flash. This is another hybrid mana card, but even if you can choose between 2 different colors of mana, we're talking about a 6-mana 4/2 with Flash, and that's it. That is an astonishingly bad rate, and it isn't really a card that does a good job of taking advantage of Flash. One of the nice things about a Flash creature is that you can have it come down out of nowhere and ambush block something and survive, but because the Merfolk costs so much and has such low power and toughness for the cost, you're virtually never going to be able to manufacture a situation where any trade you make is going to come out your way. When it came to limited, Merfolk of the Depths was sort of intended to work well with the Evolve mechanic in Gatecrash. A creature with Evolve gets a +1/+1 counter anytime a creature with higher power and toughness enters the battlefield, so the Merfolk was supposed to come down and put a couple of counters on things too. But even in that environment, which it was designed for, Merfolk of the Depths ended up being too inefficient to ever be worth playing. At number 6, it is Harbor Guardian. This is a 4-mana 3/4 with reach, and it comes with a huge downside. If you ever choose to attack with it, your opponent gets to draw a card. That's something you just can't give up, as it will quickly allow your opponent to get insane card advantage. As a result of the downside, the Guardian is effectively a 4-mana 3/4 with Defender and reach, and that's not a card you ever want to play. At number 5, I have a Losery Demon. By far the most efficient creature we've seen so far, a Losery Demon is an impressive 3-mana 4/3 with flying. However, it comes with a massive downside. If you cast a spell, you have to sacrifice it. Keep in mind, that's any spell, not a spell of any type in particular. In short, once you play a Losery Demon, you'd better be able to win the game with the board staying as it currently is, because you're not going to be able to add to it. And you also better hope that your opponent isn't going to add things to the board that you have to interact with. Of course, the demon doesn't say you can't play a spell at least, but the moment you do have to cast a spell, you end up 2-for-1ing yourself, and that's not a good place to be. At number 4, I have Emberwild Caliph. This is another pretty impressive creature when you just look at stats and keywords. It's a 4-mana 4/4 with flying and trample after all. But it also does 1 damage to you for each damage it does, and it attacks each turn if able. That's a pretty horrible combination of downsides. Attacking each turn means that you're going to be taking 4 every single turn, and it also means you can't use the Caliph to block. Although, blocking with the Caliph is almost entirely meaningless, since even blocking with it means you're taking 4 damage. It's pretty impossible for you to ever win a race with Emberwild Caliph, because it's going to do a ton of damage to you without your opponent lifting a finger. So if they're doing anything at all, you're surely going to be losing the game first. At number 3, it is Wraith Strangler. A 4-mana 2/2 is a horrible starting point, and the only upside this comes with is that you can exile a creature card from your graveyard to regenerate it. It's nice that you don't have to pay any mana for that effect, but you do need to make sure you have a well-stocked graveyard to use it. And what do you get for going through the work to regenerate the Strangler multiple times? Well, you still get a 2/2 for 4 mana, so for the most part, the best this is going to do for you is chump block every turn. And again, that's only if you have the graveyard resources to make that happen in the first place. And in a Golgari deck, giving up creatures in your graveyards for something this meager is often ill-advised, as that is the most graveyard-oriented color pair around, and you can probably find something far better to do with those creatures in your graveyard than regenerating an anemic 4-mana 2/2. At number 2, it is Mountain Titan, another 4-mana 2/2. The Titan comes with an activated ability. You can pay 1 generic and 2 red, and for the rest of your turn, the Titan gets a +1/+1 counter every time you cast a black spell. That ability does have a far higher ceiling than pretty much anything we've seen on this list, but it still isn't very practical. 3 mana is a lot to pay up front, and it will make it much harder for you to actually cast any spells that turn to buff the Titan. Furthermore, the fact the ability costs 2 red and then the Titan's ability wants you to cast black spells is itself super awkward, and means it will be even harder to line this up than it looks at first. You only have so much room for mana and cards in your deck, and this ability is pulling you in 2 very different directions in terms of the composition of your mana base and the color of cards in your deck. So this starts with horrible stats and is very difficult to actually grow effectively. I mean, even if you do manage to get like 2 counters on it, you're not really going to feel like you've accomplished anything. It's mostly just a hard to cast 4-mana 2/2, and that's a bad place to be. And at number 1, I have 4 of the multicolored vanilla legendary creatures from Legends: Barktooth Warbeard, Jedit Ojanen, Casimir the Lone Wolf, and Savitri Skarzum. As you were watching this video, you were probably thinking, how haven't there been any multicolored cards from Legends on this list? And well, this is how. Legends was the set that originally introduced multicolored cards, and the set is filled with horrible ones. So I didn't really want a bunch of cards from Legends to dominate the list. Basically, when they were designing these early multicolored cards, it seems like they didn't really know what they were doing. As I've said before in other videos, it almost feels like they thought a card costing more than one color of mana was somehow upside because they designed such woefully inefficient vanilla creatures, even for the time. Barktooth Warbeard is a 7-mana 6/5, Jedit Ojanin is a 7-mana 5/5, Casimir is a 6-mana 5/3, and Savitri Skarzim is a 7-mana 6/4. To add to just how bad these cards are, they are also legendary, meaning they come with the additional downside of the legend rule. Notably, Legends also introduced legendary creatures, so these cards represent two brand new mechanics at the time, and they are completely uninteresting, horrible cards. So, those are my picks for the 10 worst multicolored creatures in Magic. If you want to own any of these cards because, I don't know, you want to prove me wrong, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it. If you want to catch future videos, you should subscribe. If you want to catch up on the more than 600 other MTG top 10s, including many more that look at some of the worst cards in the game, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.